Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our latest edition of the Garden and Country Extension webinar series that I do here at the University of Arizona, Gila County Cooperative Extension. Today, I've got Dr. Lauren Perinsky with us. We're going to be talking about a technique called greenstripping and grazing for cheatgrass as our webinar. And she's got another title for us, and I'll hand it over to Lauren here in a moment. A little bit about these webinars. I hold them weekly by Zoom. They're 60 minutes or less, depends on what our speaker's after, and Thursdays at 11. Feature a variety of horticulture and natural resource topics relevant to the environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County. This recording will be posted at the website that we have, extension.arizona.edu/Gila. I'd like to let you know that I've got this webinar page, the Garden and Country Extension webinar page, up to date right now. So if you want to see the upcoming talks through October, they're ready. So feel free to do that. And be aware that the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Just our agenda here, and I forgot to fix the top one up there, darn it. I'm your moderator, Chris Jones. We're going to be talking about a technique called greenstripping for the controlled cheatgrass with Dr. Lauren Perinsky. At about a half hour later, we'll have some brief updates. I'll provide the evaluation link. As a matter of fact, it's already in the chat box for you. We'll have our question and answer discussion, a little time for open discussion as possible, and then we'll wrap up by noon, get off to lunch. This is our presenter, Dr. Lauren Perinsky. She is a research ecologist at the USDA Agriculture Research Service at Fort Collins, Colorado. That's the Grand Canyon behind her, though. And at this time, I am ready to change the share. So we're going to give it over to Lauren. And her slides are set to go. And
can you all see that? Can you see that, Chris?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be invited to speak to you all, and I hope that some of what I'll say is relevant to your region. My background is in plant ecology, so I've done some restoration work and also a lot of work on livestock and other large herbivore grazing. And a few years ago now, in 2013, I got a grant from the Western Integrated Pest Management Program, which I really recommend you all to check out. It's a really neat program. The Western IPM Center puts out a nice newsletter with lots of good information. But they gave us some money to try and figure out novel strategies for combating cheatgrass in the Western US. So we are going to talk mostly here about targeted grazing and restoration treatments that include greenstripping and other treatments to reduce invasive species and establish native plants in invaded ecosystems. And this project is a collaboration between me and, can you guys see my cursor? Chris, can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
Good. So Beth Ledger at University of Nevada, Reno, and then Barry Perryman, who's also at University of Nevada, Reno. And we've had tons of help from a bunch of different groups, including Grand Canyon Trust in Arizona, and also the Arizona Game and Fish Department has been involved. So this project really grew out of concern about cheatgrass invasion across the Western US, and particularly these cheatgrass wildfire feedback cycles that we're seeing. So basically, cheatgrass tends to fill in spaces between shrubs and other less dense plants and create this continuous fuel bed that then can produce wildfires. And because cheatgrass is well adapted to fire and other shrubs and other plants are not as well adapted, the fires can actually promote more invasion and lead to ecosystem conversion in Western rangelands. And I think in your area, you guys are dealing more with a different brome species, red brome, but the same general processes happen in that system. We were focused on cheatgrass and trying to figure out how can we disrupt this vicious cycle of fire and invasion. And one common way that people try and do this is with post-fire plantings of native plants. So after a fire burns through an area, people will come through and plant seeds and hope to grow native species there instead of cheatgrass. And that works sometimes, but unfortunately, sometimes we get the outcome seen here where you've got these nice drill rows, but they're actually all filled with cheatgrass rather than the species that you wanted. And this is actually pretty common. So across the Western US, we're spending billions of dollars, the BLM is, for example, on post-fire reseeding. But typically only about 0 to 3% of our seeds survive. And in this one area in Elko County, which is one of the wetter parts of Nevada, where we should expect more success, they only had an average about 1% establishment success in 5 different fires. So basically we're wasting 99% of our effort, money, and time trying to grow these plants. So we need some new solutions to this problem. And so we were sort of invited to try and think through what are some innovative ways to approach this. So one thing we started to think about was this idea of targeted grazing, which has been getting a lot of attention recently. Now we know that historically heavy grazing has been implicated in the spread of cheatgrass and other invasives across the Western US because heavy grazing can reduce our native perennial plant cover and open up space for invasives to get in there. However, we can also use grazing. Grazing is not just one thing. We can use grazing at certain times of year or with certain kinds of animals to try and hit cheatgrass harder than our native plants. So we've shown, some work has shown that targeted grazing in the fall or spring, for example, can help reduce wildfire frequency or spread by doing things like increasing fuel moisture, reducing litter cover, reducing fuel connectivity in the system, and then directly reducing the biomass density or seed set of our invasive species. So we were thinking, okay, can we use this sort of fall or spring cattle grazing to try and reduce wildfire frequency or spread, and then also directly reduce our invasives. And we also wanted to think about how to combine that technique with the idea of green strips. So green strips are linear plantings that people have used to create fuel breaks in systems. And they're commonly made up of vegetation with low biomass and large gaps. So basically vegetation that won't allow a fire to pass through, or vegetation that might stay green during the fire season. So basically vegetation that when a fire hit it, the fire would sort of fizzle out or at least reduce its intensity. Now, obviously these green strips have to resist invasive annuals so they themselves are not getting invaded. And they also must be able to establish and persist in dry sites. So here's an example from Idaho. There's been a lot of work on this throughout the Western US, and this is a green strip of blue bunch wheatgrass that's basically able to resist cheatgrass. And there's examples of these same green strips preventing fire from crossing. So these things have potential benefits. They can reduce fire size or fire frequency, and they could also be used as buffers to prevent fire spread into places where we really don't want it. So for example, a really nice planting that we have, or a nice remnant area of native plants that we really want to protect, we could use something like this to prevent fire spread into those areas. And this is getting a lot of attention. Like I said, this is a study just out on examples of fuel breaks being used across the Western US. Now, this is all types of fuel breaks, not just green strips, but there are an estimated over 100 or over 10,000 linear kilometers of fuel breaks already existing in the Great Basin. And there's a lot of proposals for more of these, including green strips. And so this is something that we're really interested in doing more research on to understand what are the impacts of these things, what are their pros and cons. So green strips have a few additional benefits as compared to things like brown strips, so herbicide, for example, along the side of a roadway, or mowing. Mowing can create a fuel break. But green strips have a few additional potential advantages. One is that we can use native species, so we can provide more spaces for our native species to exist. We can also if they succeed, then they're easier to maintain because they are themselves planting, so you don't have to go and repeatedly herbicide or repeatedly mow. And with green strips, as opposed to just a broader planting of native plants, we can focus on sites that have a high probability of success. So maybe planting where we have a little better soil type or a little more water availability. And if we're focused on a narrow green strip as opposed to a wide post-fire planting, we can maybe spend more money per acre and try and improve our success rate that way. So we could try and plant maybe more expensive species that might do better, or more local genotypes that are harder to obtain, but that might actually do better in that location. Or we could use sort of new planting or seed technologies, such as these coated seeds that are shown down here at the bottom. These are seeds that are coated with a surfactant that's intended to improve their water uptake and their survival. And obviously that's expensive, but if we're only doing a small sort of targeted area, it might be easier to accomplish. So yeah, this is sort of trying to synthesize some of these ideas. So with a green strip approach, rather than having 3% success on the whole landscape, maybe we can have 100% success on a smaller portion of the landscape and sort of break up that landscape to prevent fires from flowing across it. So the project I'm going to talk to you about is trying to combine these two different approaches, targeted grazing and green strips, to control cheatgrass. And I think you can put questions. I really want this to be pretty informal. You can put questions in the chat, I believe, or the Q&A, so feel free to do that. I'm looking forward to our discussion. So this is the idea, right? I already told you about cattle grazing. It can reduce wildfire by doing things like reducing litter and reducing invasive plant biomass. And maybe by doing those things, cattle grazing could indirectly help native plants that we're trying to establish in the system. But cattle grazing could also have negative direct impacts on plants we're trying to grow. So if we are trying to grow plants and also graze cattle, it's sort of unclear whether that's going to be net positive for these native plant green strips we're trying to grow or net negative. So the project was sort of trying to look into all these feedbacks and figure out, how does all this play out? So we thought that our targeted fall and spring grazing might reduce our fuel loads, litter cover, and invasive plant densities. And we also suspected that targeted grazing after we planted native plants might reduce our seedling densities of the plants we wanted. And we thought spring grazing might have a more negative effect than fall grazing, since the plants are growing more in the spring. In the fall, they're mostly dormant. But we hoped that by doing things like using higher seed rates, using these seed coatings that I briefly showed you, or using more competitive native grass species, we might be able to improve our seedling establishment and offset the negative effects of targeted grazing. So the goal here is to hopefully get both, get targeted grazing to reduce wildfire, and also get native plants established in these green strips that would help to reduce wildfire as well. We did this in two different places. We did it in northern Nevada and then also in northern Arizona. So we're really trying to see, like, are these systems similar in how they respond to these different treatments, or do they respond in different ways? And I'll tell you about the Nevada project first. So in Nevada, we had 9 45-acre paddocks, and we arranged them into 3 different blocks of a fall-grazed, a spring-grazed, and an ungrazed paddock. So we had block 1 of those 3 treatments, and then block 2 and block 3. And then within each of those paddocks, we planted a bunch of mini experimental green strips. So we had 6 different treatments in Nevada. We had seeds all mixed together to look at sort of a typical planting of mixed seeds. We also did these strip plantings where we planted species in different strips so that we could evaluate the success of different species we were planting. And each of those, we had a low seed rate and then a high seed rate example. So we were looking at the effect of just adding more seed. And then we also had some areas within each experimental green strip that had coated seed and some that had uncoated seed to look at the effect of that coating treatment. And then we compared all those to some other typical green strip approaches or fuel break approaches. So herbicide only, so this is your classic brown strip. And then we also planted forage kochia, which is a commonly used plant in green strips. And we did a test of that as well. And then all these red and black dots are where we sampled plants in the subsequent years. These are the species we used for both Nevada and Arizona. We just focused on native grasses because that's typically what people are planting in these green strips unless they're planting forage kochia. And we had 2 species that were common at both sites, so we used them at both sites, squirrel tail and mutton grass, and then the 3 other species were different between the 2 sites, just based on species that occurred there and we expected might do well. And we tried to vary the palatability to grazers of the different species. And then this is just our seed rates, which are fairly high, especially in Arizona because we were broadcast seeding in Arizona. In Nevada, we could use a drill seeder, but in Arizona, the soils were too rocky and the topography was too steep, and so we had to broadcast seed. So this is our planting in Nevada using a 3-box drill. So we were able to sort of use a drill that managed our seeds, some of which had like big awns and were difficult to plant. But we managed it. And then we monitored. So we planted in fall 2014 and we monitored in 2015 and 16. And we were really focused on, did our seedlings emerge that we had planted, and what was the grazing and the planting doing to cheatgrass biomass and cover. So these are just getting into some of our results for Nevada. I'll orient you to these graphs. So on the bottom here is time. So we have before grazing on the left, after fall grazing in the middle, and then after spring grazing on the right. So remember, different paddocks were grazed in either the fall or the spring. And then on the y-axis, we have standing biomass here. And so before grazing, all the paddocks had similar amounts of biomass. After fall grazing, our fall grazed plots had lower biomass than ungrazed plots, which was good. Fall grazing reduced biomass. And then in the spring, we saw that, again, spring grazing, so orange versus yellow, spring grazing reduced biomass. But what was really interesting here is that the fall grazed plots still had lower biomass the next year. So the fall grazing effect really persisted into the next growing season. And so, yes, generally cattle grazing reduced our fuel loads, which was one thing that we really wanted to see. However, our grazing and planting treatments did not have big effects on other things that we wanted, such as litter cover, invasive species cover, or invasive species density. And one thing that might be affecting this is the year that we did our second year monitoring was super wet in this system, and we just had a ton of weeds come up. So this is one of our texts, like trying to count cheatgrass in a sea of cheatgrass. So the weather might have sort of overwhelmed any effects that we might have had, unfortunately. But we did see that, okay, so yeah, so litter cover, invasive species cover, invasive species density were not affected, but we did see some effects on our seedlings that we planted. So this is seedlings per meter squared in our different treatments, so fall grazed, spring grazed, and ungrazed. And you can see that cattle grazing did have a negative impact on our seedlings that we planted. So seedling densities were highest in ungrazed and lowest in fall grazed and intermediate in the spring grazed treatment. So this was actually, if you'll recall, different than what we expected. We expected spring grazing to be worse, but in fact, fall grazing a year after the plants had been planted was a little bit worse than spring grazing during the second growing season. So we've got this trade-off, right? Cattle grazing is doing something we want. It's reducing fuel loads, but it's also doing something we don't want. It's reducing our native plant establishment in these green strips. So is there any way to mitigate that trade-off? So what we found was seed rate really mattered in this experiment. This is just how many seedlings we had of what we planted in the control treatment. So that was very low because we didn't plant anything there. And then in the high rate grass treatments, the low rate grass treatments, the herbicide, and the kochia. So one thing to note is our forage kochia treatment did not do well. It had pretty low seedlings. But the other thing to note here is that the grass high rate did a lot better than the grass low rate treatment. And we also found that it mattered whether you planted the right species. So basically we had two species that did much better. One was slender wheat and one was Sandberg's bluegrass in Nevada. And both of these had more seedlings per meter squared than other species. And what was interesting about this was slender wheatgrass grew a lot in the first year, but was also appeared to be really sensitive to grazing. So it really declined for example, in those fall-grazed treatments. Whereas the Sandberg's bluegrass did a little bit worse in the first growing season, but I'll show you in a second, it really was resistant to grazing. So it persisted through the grazing treatment. So this is just showing that in more detail. And I'll explain this graph to you. So this is seedlings per meter squared again, and this is just focusing on slender wheatgrass. And this is grazing treatment. So fall grazing is over here, spring grazing in the middle, and ungrazed on the right. And the first thing to note here is that this open circle is low seed rate with uncoated seeds. And you can see it's lower overall, but it's especially low in the fall grazed treatment. So grazing really reduced the success of this species, especially fall grazing. But the high rate seed rate treatment did a little bit better, especially like in the fall grazed treatment, but especially in the spring grazed treatment, and also when we coated it. So there's these complex interactions happening where if we planted a lot of seed and we coated it and we grazed it in the spring rather than the fall, then this slender wheatgrass did okay. So you can see this is like pretty context dependent and complicated. It's not something that probably you could extrapolate to everywhere and say, oh, just plant slender wheatgrass. It's more complicated than that. And just to reinforce that, oh, this is what I already said. So fall grazed did better when we either coated or added more seed, and especially when we had high seed rate and coated seed in the spring. So this is the same graph for Sandberg's bluegrass, again showing when we didn't coat and had low rate seed and then grazed it in the fall, it did really poorly. But some of these other treatments, coating and high rate seeding, actually really improved our success. And in particular, like either adding seed or coating the seeds led to much higher success in the fall grazed treatment, and especially if we had high rate coated seed in the spring grazed treatment. It did even better than the ungrazed treatment. So some of these like additional technologies like coating or just adding more seed can really offset the negative impacts of grazing for some of these species. All right, I'm going to summarize Nevada quickly here and then move to Arizona, and we can come back and get into the nitty-gritty here during the discussion section. But basically what we saw in Nevada is that fall and spring grazing did reduce fuel loads, which is what we wanted, but it didn't help us with reducing litter cover or invasive species densities. We did see that targeted grazing in the second growing season reduced our seedling densities, but actually fall was worse than spring, which was not what we had expected. And then things like higher seed rates, seed coating, and certain species really helped us and improved seedling establishment and actually mitigated the negative effects of grazing for some of those plant species. All right, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk about Arizona. and whether things worked the same way in Arizona. Now, Arizona was a really different system. This is on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, just west of the Kaibab. It's on the Kaibab Plateau, just west of the forest there. And this system, unlike the Nevada system, was lightly invaded. So it had a lot of native plants already there and sort of a low density of cheatgrass. And managers had been seeing this cheatgrass fire cycle start to operate in this system. So areas that had burned were getting more cheatgrass, and they were really concerned about that sort of incipient fire invasion cycle happening in this system. But starting out, it was in a lot better shape than the Nevada system. The Nevada system was just like pretty much completely cheatgrass when we started. So I think that's important to keep in mind as I go through how results differed in Arizona. So we had a similar site layout in Arizona, but rather than having fall grazing and spring grazing, we just had pairs of plots. So we had spring grazing and then ungrazed. And that's because managers didn't think fall grazing was a very useful treatment in this system and wanted to focus on spring grazing. So we've got 9 pairs of plots, and then 6 of them had a spring grazing treatment and an ungrazed treatment, and the other 3, for operational ranch reasons, we never were able to graze that spring, so they're all ungrazed. And before we started, because we had native plants in the system, before we started our planting treatments, we took some data on what is going on now, like what native plants are doing a good job of resisting cheatgrass already, before we go in and try and plant stuff. And really what we saw is that our cool season perennial grasses, our C3 perennial grasses, were doing a really good job at resisting cheatgrass. So areas with more cool season perennial grass cover tended to have lower cheatgrass cover, lower cheatgrass density, and lower cheatgrass inflorescences. And then shrubs also were reducing at least flowering of cheatgrass. So, and this is interesting. This is just correlational data. So we really had to do the experiment to figure out, okay, are the C3 grasses reducing cheatgrass, or is the cheatgrass actually reducing the C3 grasses? And I think the data I'll show you will support the idea that the C3 grasses are actually resisting the cheatgrass. We also did some work on which species are actually the best at resisting cheatgrass. So we took some data on cheatgrass densities right next to adult bunch grasses of different species. And I apologize for these codes, but this is ricegrass, this is bottlebrush squirreltail, this is western wheatgrass, this is mutton grass, and this is sand drop seed. And these different perennial grass species, we measured how many cheatgrass plants are there 0 to 10 centimeters from the base of the adult perennial, and then at further distances away, 10 to 20 centimeters and 20 to 50 centimeters. So how many cheatgrass plants per meter squared did we find right next to adult perennial grasses? And what we found is these plants really differed in their ability to reduce densities close to them. And the mutton grass in particular was really good at having low densities of cheatgrass right next to it, compared to something like ricegrass or sand drop seed. So this was really interesting and showed us, again, the importance of species identity and how different species have different abilities to keep cheatgrass out. So in Arizona, we had a really similar experimental design. I told you already we only did the spring grazing treatment, but we had mixed plantings, and then we had these monoculture strips so we could look at different species. We had coated seed and uncoated seed again. We had low rate plantings, and we had high seed rate plantings, and we had an herbicide treatment. We didn't plant the forage kochia here because we were on national forest land, and so we couldn't plant the forage kochia treatment there. What we found, again, just like in Nevada, is that seed rate really mattered. So in Arizona, we had much lower success of seedlings per meter squared. And in fact, only the high rate seed outperformed our control treatment. So here we've got seed rate on the x-axis, high, low, or no seed. And you can see there's a bunch of seedlings occurring in the unseeded areas, and that's because we had perennial native plants already in the system producing these seedlings. So these are just seedlings of our planted species. But we got more of them when we planted high rates of seed. So this is good. You know, when you plant more seeds, you get more plants. That's good. But what we also saw here was a slight interaction between grazing and seed rate. So in the grazed plots, we actually had more seedlings when we grazed them and planted with a lot of seeds than when we didn't graze them. And this interaction wasn't super strong, but just keep it in mind as I go through this, because it shows up in multiple places in Arizona. So here it is again. This is splitting up the data between the mixture plots, high rate, mixture plots, low rate, the monoculture strip plots, high rate, and monoculture strip plots, low rate. And again here, the black bars are grazed and the gray bars are ungrazed. And you can see we got more seedlings in a bunch of these treatments in the grazed than the ungrazed plots. Now this is, again, not super strong, but this trend is here across our data. And so this suggests something really different is happening in Arizona compared to Nevada, right? In Nevada, our grazing reduced our seedling establishment densities, whereas in Arizona, if anything, it's not reducing them, and if anything, it might be increasing them a little bit. We also got different results in Arizona than Nevada for coated seeds, okay? So in Nevada, remember, seed coating tended to help, especially in high rate or spring grazed situations, and coating didn't generally reduce our seedling establishment. But in Arizona, our uncoated seeds actually did better than our coated seeds, and the coated seeds didn't do any better than where we didn't plant seeds at all in terms of how many seedlings established. So coating did not help. That investment was not worth it in our Arizona setting. And we think the reason might be because I mentioned in Arizona we did broadcast seeding, and these coated seeds were really apparent just visually in our broadcast seeding. And we think, you know, the coating in Arizona might have made these more apparent to either seed predators or just they weren't able to get good soil seed contact, and so the surfactant coating actually hurt them rather than helping them in the Arizona setting. So all of these, again, like I'm coming back around to the idea that it's pretty complex, and like we don't have a single silver bullet here that's going to work everywhere or with every species. Okay, so how did our seeding in Arizona affect cheatgrass? This is cheatgrass cover on the bottom and cheatgrass biomass on the top. And basically what the point I'm trying to make with this graph, again, black is grazed and gray is ungrazed, is that high rate seedings tended to have less cheatgrass cover after 2 years in Arizona. So our seedings actually seem to be reducing cheatgrass in Arizona, whereas in Nevada, our seedings weren't having any impact on cheatgrass cover. And then also grazing in the low rate seeding, grazing seemed to somewhat reduce cheatgrass biomass. So grazing again seems to be having a little bit of the positive effect we wanted in terms of reducing invasive species biomass, reducing fuel loads. And in this case, the greenstripping also is reducing cheatgrass cover. So in Arizona, as in Nevada, high seed rates improve seedling establishment, and high seed rates seem to reduce our cheatgrass cover. But unlike Nevada, seed coating actually reduced establishment success in this place. And also unlike Nevada, spring grazing tended to improve seedling establishment, particularly in places where we planted a lot of seeds. And spring grazing might have also reduced our cheatgrass biomass in certain plots. So I think I have a couple of take-home messages here before we jump into discussion, but I think what these results show is that some of these techniques can help, particularly when we're trying to reduce fire size, intensity, or frequency, or prevent the spread of fire into uninvaded or restored areas. We found evidence from our sites that targeted grazing can reduce our fuel loads, and that planting, especially with high rates, we can create these green strips that can reduce, at least in the Arizona case, reduce cheatgrass cover. However, results depended strongly on spatial context. And this is a common story in restoration globally. I've just been involved in a global synthesis of restoration outcomes. And basically, one of the take-homes from that study is, people are good at restoration globally, but there's very few predictors of, what's going to drive that success. And pretty much the only predictor globally of increased success is seed rate. So when you plant more seeds, you get more plants. And I think it's an obvious result to some degree, but it's also underappreciated that, rather than trying more complex technologies or other sort of more expensive techniques, it might be worth your time to just invest more money in seed and just get more seed on the ground if you're trying to restore areas. We're working now sort of beyond seedling emergence. So all these results I showed you were just the first 2 years after planting. And we know that in restoration, we're after long-term outcomes, and it can often take a lot longer than 2 years to figure out what's going on. So we are working on looking at these plots to see how maturing green strips function, whether they're going to be better at resisting cheatgrass as those plants get bigger, whether they're going to be able to reduce fuel loads or fuel connectivity as those plants get bigger. And we also have been regrazing some of these sites to look at how repeated fall or spring grazing can impact our outcomes. A lot of the areas in Nevada that are interested in targeted grazing, they're really trying to hammer on the same areas in multiple years. And so we're really curious, A, does that really have a big impact on the fires? And then B, how does that affect our native plants that we're trying to grow in these green strips? And I'm going to stop there. I know I've just presented a ton of information. This project was huge, and before we get into questions and answers, I want to acknowledge all these different people who have worked on the project, particularly our Arizona collaborators. Since you guys are an Arizona group, we've been working with the Grand Canyon Trust. Sarissa Hoglander, Ed Grumbine was involved in this project, and then a whole bunch of funding agencies, as I mentioned. And just a shout out again to the Western Integrated Pest Management Program. It's definitely worth a look if you're interested in these topics. And with that, here's my email for anyone who's interested in connecting directly, but I think, Chris, we could jump into questions and answers if you want.
I do. Thank you so much, Lauren. I was a rapt attendee. I've got lots of questions. We got one in the Q&A. If you go ahead and take a look at that, I've got a poll for people. Just want to find out how they heard about this. Did they get an email from me? Did they get it forwarded? We also do this in Facebook and the newspapers. So just want to see how people find out about these events, these talks, and the other thing I want to do is just remind people about the evaluation. So I'm going to put that back in here one more time, and just take some time to hit that for me. It'll only take about 60 seconds or less. Just say how it went, if you got any ideas for presentations. So really appreciate you participating on that. So in the meantime, Lauren, did you look at that question from?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we planted in the fall in both places. So I believe it was like October, November. And we grazed, so we planted in the fall of 2014. We gave it a year to grow, and then the fall planting in Nevada happened the following fall. So it had had one full growing season, and then we grazed it. And then the spring planting happened the spring after that. So basically in both the fall and spring grazing treatments, the plants had had one full year to grow, and then they were sort of either dormant or just about to start their second growing season when we grazed.
Okay. All right. Well, please give us your questions in the Q&A or the chat. I'm gonna get some of the things that I wanted to ask about here. How big are these green strips? What type of width are they, and what are you doing with them here?
Yeah, so our experimental ones were really small. So they were just 20 by 60 meters or 20 by 60 yards-ish, but those were just sort of tests. In the real world, these green strips vary a lot in their width, and typically they're quite long. So the idea is to sort of run them through an area to keep a fire from crossing. So I think the width typically is more like a between 50 and 100 meters. And then, yeah, the length, as you saw in that picture of the Western US, there's fuel breaks, at least, maybe not green strips, but fuel breaks that are hundreds of miles long at this point in the Great Basin. So green strips are less common. And so I would say, you know, they're probably a lot shorter.
But a width of at least 50 meters, they're pretty good size.
They are, yeah.
Or even
I think,
football field more.
Go ahead.
The width would be like a football field or more, you know, or in some cases.
Like half a football field. I think some are narrower. I mean, this concept is still pretty new, so I think the agencies are still sort of playing around with options. But what I can tell you is right now they're seeding, you know, with this post-fire reseeding model, they're seeding hundreds of thousands of acres with low density seed. And you saw from my results that low density seed doesn't tend to do that well. So, you know, even if it's a football field, that's a heck of a lot smaller than what they're trying to do right now. And maybe we could, if we could concentrate all that seed in, you know, a narrow strip, we might have higher success.
And I mean, the footprint that you're working with is really important. I'm looking at this, you know, how can we use in the wildland urban interface? How can we prevent these fires from coming in and hitting our, you know, just making our communities safer? These fires that we've just had recently north of the globe, I'm noticing what they do is they look where can they put in their fire operations so that they can protect the resources. And so they'll find a road, they'll find some place to backburn out of. You'll get the footprint, and then they basically burn back into the fire.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're able to get these green strips close to communities, and if they're as wide as 100 meters, then maybe they become better for grazing, because grazing, I think, is really good, important opportunity. And grazing also, one important thing it does in Arizona is it helps to put that seed in the ground. Cattle walk on it, and that mixing of the soil and getting it, just like you said, those coated ones, we had a lot of predation on it, I suppose, a lot of bivory, where that's just important in these types of soils we have. We got another question in the chat box here, I noticed. Don Salcito is asking, what determined your types of native grasses? So the ones you were picking.
Yeah, that was another great question. So first we tried to pick grasses that we thought would succeed in our different sites. So we obviously weren't planting all the same things in Arizona and Nevada. But secondly, so back at the beginning I said for green strips, there's two sort of strategies that one could use. One is to pick a plant that has relatively low biomass and creates large gaps between multiple plants. And that sort of would keep fires from moving by reducing connectivity of fuels. So it's like less fuel and there's gaps between the plants. The other approach is to pick a plant that hopefully stays green later in the growing season, so that it's gonna sort of cause the fire to hit an area of higher fuel moisture and sort of reduce the fire's ability to spread through there. So we tried to pick plants that had both of those strategies. So some, like for example, Sandberg's bluegrass is one that's small, tends to be able to produce sort of patchy vegetation with gaps between plants, versus something like Western wheat is much taller, but also might stay green later in the growing season and prevent those annual grass fires from moving as quickly. So we tried to pick up a diversity of different sort of approaches and test out different species. And we also varied their palatability. So we picked, because we knew we were combining this with grazing, we wanted to pick some that we knew might be more palatable and some that might be less palatable to cattle, just to test out different approaches.
And you were typically working with cool season grasses, or were there warm season grasses that were able to hold that gap or biomass to hold the invasives down?
So we only, in our mixes, we only had one warm season grass, and that was Sandberg's sand seed. All the rest were cool seasons, and that really reflected, I mean, in the Great Basin, we have mostly cool season species. And then in Northern Arizona, there are some warm season species, but not many. And a lot of those that there are really hard to grow from seed. Like, for example, blue grandma is really hard to grow from seed. So we decided to go with mostly cool seasons. But we did have one warm season. Now, what I didn't show this result, but one really interesting thing about sand seed is it really doesn't compete well with cheatgrass, and compared to some of the cool seasons. And I touched on sort of that cool season perennial grass being able to resist cheatgrass better than some of the other functional groups. And we saw that repeatedly, both with our sand seed and with just C4 grasses, warm season grasses that were there. They did not do as well at reducing our cheatgrass as the cool seasons. And probably why that is that the warm seasons are growing at a different time of year than the cheatgrass. So the cheatgrass can kind of get going early, take up all the resources, and then the warm season grass isn't going to sort of be competing with it. It's going to be growing later on in the season.
And the further south you go in Arizona, the more that's the model, where we've got mostly warm season grasses, a few cool season grasses. I appreciate your bringing up the carbon pathways. What do you know about red cheatgrass? Is that a C3 or a C4 pathway?
It's a C3, yeah. And I think all the annual brooms are, but I'm not certain on that. I'm mostly familiar with cheatgrass. Yeah. But I know it's a C3, but it's a winter annual, so that's just a very different life cycle than our warm season perennials.
Another question I have for you, what types of topographies and slopes were you working with in both sites? Because that's another, well, you see a lot of slope there off the view there, the Grand Canyon looking at, so
Yeah, that's a great question. In Nevada, it was pretty flat. So that made things easy for us. We could run a drill through there, for example. In Arizona, we had a lot of slope, but things weren't cliffy. I mean, it was still sort of, it was gentle enough that we could drive a UTV through it, for example, and run our broadcast seeder that way, but we couldn't run a drill really, big equipment. It was too hilly and too rocky really to do that, so.
And yeah, our topography always changes, and that's a tough one too. But I was wondering if there was any just steep places where it just wasn't going to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, when we selected sites, I'm trying to remember if we specifically rejected. I'm sure there were one or two places where we just said, this is, we're not going to be able to seed here. For the most part, when we were selecting sites, we looked for places that had cheatgrass and weren't like unreasonable. So, and I'm sure managers who are thinking about green strips would be doing the same thing. They're not going to try and seed through the canyon here or anything like that. So yeah, practicality is definitely a real concern.
Just want to remind the people who are still with us to ask any questions in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll attend to those. The grazing, was there a certain intensity that you're using, certain number of cattle? And did you have them out there to put pressure on the cheatgrass?
Yeah, so the idea was to try and graze, not hard, but graze in a way that targeted the cheatgrass as opposed to the other plants that were growing there. So We tried to graze in the late fall, which has been shown to reduce sort of this thatch layer that cheatgrass produces, and the thatch layer benefits the next year's cheatgrass. So if you can knock back that fuel load, not only are you reducing the chance of wildfire, but you're also making it harder for next year's cheatgrass to survive. And then in the spring, we tried to graze at the time when cheatgrass was green and palatable to cattle. But before a lot of our native plants were up and growing. So that was pretty early. I mean, it was like as early as we could get the cows in there after the snow in Arizona. So that was like April up on the Kaibab Plateau. And then also early April in Nevada. And that's been, spring grazing has been shown to just directly reduce seed set of cheatgrass because you're eating those plants down, those annuals, and they can't really recover that easily within the same growing season. What was the other part of your question? Oh, how many cattle? Yeah, so we targeted a utilization intensity of about 50% in Nevada and we ended up doing about 30% in Arizona. So this really isn't like super heavy grazing. And that was for multiple reasons. That was, ranch logistics and also just manager interest in not sort of overgrazing these areas. But yeah, we used about 20 animals for about 5 to 7 days in most cases. In Arizona, I think it was longer, like 2 weeks. It depended because Arizona had more standing biomass, so it took a little longer to get that biomass eaten off.
It's such a wicked problem because cows aren't lawnmowers. I mean, they kind of are, but they and each year is different. So sometimes it can be out there in such huge numbers. There's no way you can have enough cattle to do it. And the next year it's drought, and there's no way you can keep them alive. So it's a real tough one. But,
yeah, it's tricky. I have some collaborators here in Wyoming who are working hard on trying to identify like the specific window of time when cattle will go for cheatgrass as opposed to other plants. And it appears to be just a few weeks before cheatgrass starts flowering. When it gets above about 4 inches but isn't flowering yet, that's the window when the cattle can really hit it hard. And so what that means is that if managers are trying to catch that window, they've got to be really flexible and have sort of animals on hand, which is hard for people to do. I mean, they have to be eating something, so.
What else? Yeah, just the drought, some years it's wet, some years it's dry. It tends to be, I think when I younger, and I think it's gotten worse recently, but 10-year average in Arizona was 7 years drought and 3 years of rain. And it seems like that might even have changed, but it's got a lot of droughty time, and then when it rains, it's just more flashy systems. So just when you've got green out there, it's just kind of a tough time. What do you think of some other species, perennial, I guess if it's shrubby or if it's woody, I mean, that's fuel. We're down here, we've got plenty of cactus, nopal, prickly pear, might be something we could try to take advantage of. But have you looked at anything that might be other perennials? I mean, perennial grasses, of course, are good.
I'm thinking about shrubs. I mean, shrubs are fuel, but if they can maintain gaps between them, then they could stop a fire because it's not going to be able to jump those gaps. Yeah, I'm not that familiar with desert systems, but I feel like in the desert, what you're probably going to want to go for is more like creating patchiness rather than creating greenness, because greenness is going to be hard to maintain in a dry system. But if you can create enough patchiness, then it's going to be hard for a fire to move through the system. And I know there's some perennial grasses that do that even in dry systems. like crested wheat grows in pretty dry places. That's not a native plant, but it does create pretty patchy vegetation. Yeah, and maybe some of the shrubs, if they're able to sort of, I haven't done work on this, but if they're able to create bare patches between the shrubs and keep the cheatgrass out of those bare patches, then they would function well to stop a fire.
So hard to keep that cheatgrass out. And I just don't know if it would respond much to anything that may be allelopathic. When we have, I don't know if you, we have a place called Roosevelt Lake in the Tonto Basin. And when we had the woodbury fire a couple of years ago, you know, it's a lot of creosote, and in between it just filled up with red brome. You could just see,
Yeah.
you see in all the voids, it just filled it all up. And sure enough, that woodbury fire happened and it went right through
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, if those annuals are able to fill up the space, then, or the red brome is able to fill up the space, then the fire can move really quickly through that system. So I'm seeing a question about picture of cheatgrass, and I'm gonna stop sharing because I actually have a slide, if I can find it, that has like all the different brooms shown. So I'm gonna try and grab that real quick.
Screen, so yeah, you should be able to do all that.
Let's see. Okay, maybe this will work. Can you see that?
Yeah, go ahead and hit that on full screen.
Okay. Oh, shoot. Okay, so this is cheatgrass. These are all annual brooms in the Western US. So there's a whole bunch of them, including red brome. This is cheatgrass down here, so it's got rather long awns. This is field brome, Bromus arvensis. Cheatgrass is Bromus tectorum. Bromus arvensis is also common in the Great Plains further east, and also in Texas. And then I don't know the rest of these that well. Maybe you do, Chris, but red brome is obviously one of these.
Yeah, that one on the top left-hand corner, that looks very much how it presents itself. And it'll say tufted like that in the early spring, and nobody wants to eat that. I mean, the cattle to see that, and it just stands there, and it's still standing out in the you know, I took the dog for a walk this morning. It's all turned to straw, and most of that's dropped off, but it still has some seed heads in it.
Mm-hmm.
Still standing, so it's a real.
Yeah, so these are, you know, there's a bunch of different offenders here. All of these sort of cause the same annual grass fire feedbacks, and they're all sort of problematic across different areas. Some of these are more common in California, and then, you know, the Southwest area, so.
Well, I'm gonna change the screen here. Thank you so much for your time today. I don't know if we have any more questions, but we're getting on noon here. So thank you, Izzy, for asking that. We got a nice picture of the grasses there. I'd hoped to have more of my range colleagues participate today, but I'll share this with them and be asking some questions and what we can think about it. I'm gonna bring back up my closing slides. And thank you so much for having gone in and doing the survey for me. And we've had our Q&A. And just to let you know that next week, we have Jake Garrett, who works for Gila County Wastewater, and he's going to talk to us about septic tank health. So if you live someplace with a septic tank or it's new to you, you know, if you keep your septic tank happy, it'll keep you happy, right? And so a little bit different than what we have today, but that's what we got coming up. Lauren, I really appreciate you taking your time today and sharing all this with us.
Thanks. I really appreciate the invitation, and feel free to get in touch with me if anyone's interested in talking about this in more detail.
All right, well, great research, and I hope to get to see you sometime when we're allowed to travel again. Everybody have a good evening.